Hello, I'm Mateo Farina. I'm a postdoctoral fellow at the School of Gerontology at the University of Southern California. I'm also affiliated with the USC RCMAR Center. Today, I will be presenting some work that evaluates how life course pathways to dementia incidence differs by race. This work incorporates a historical perspective by considering how the Jim Crow South may have shaped dementia risk, especially for older Black adults today. But before I begin, I want to give a broad overview of what has already been found. In the United States, stark racial inequalities in dementia exist. Black older adults are 2 to 3 times more likely to have dementia, and they also are more likely to experience it at younger ages and are expected to live more years of life with dementia. This points to a disproportionate burden of dementia for the Black community. Scholars have turned to understanding the race disparity in dementia by evaluating several different risk factors found throughout life. Researchers in particular have pointed to racial inequality through socioeconomic adversity in early life, lower levels of education, increased risk of some cardiometabolic conditions, such as diabetes. And in the study, I built on this work by evaluating how several of these risk factors develop over an individual's life and kind of looking at the pathways and how they accumulate together. Additionally, given the importance that context plays in shaping health, no study to date has really incorporated information on the South to explore how it might impact Blacks and whites differently. I take on a historical perspective in considering how the Jim Crow South may have impacted dementia risk, and in particularly for older Blacks who lived in the South during childhood. So to provide insight into some of these knowledge gaps, I asked two primary research questions. The first question is basically, are the life course pathways to dementia incident contingent on race? So in other words, do we see the same developments of risk for Blacks and whites? And the second question is, what role does the Jim Crow South play? And we observed increased risks for Blacks and whites for being born in the South during this time? And are the associations equally explained by common risk factors such as educational attainment and adult health behaviors? So why do we look at the South? First, broadly speaking, people in the South have greater risk of dementia. It has been referred to as the dementia belt, and this could be linked to lower levels of education, especially since education has been one of the most primary risk factors for understanding dementia. But going beyond the broad context that might impact both race groups, the Black experience in the South is unique in that the race caste system largely curtailed economic, political, and social rights of even the most affluent Black people. And this is to suggest that it's not just about education, but might stem to other sources of stress or marginalization. So here I present a heuristic model of the life course developments of dementia risk. And as you can see, I have 4 primary stages that are being evaluated. So we have early childhood, education, adulthood, and later adulthood. And this model allows us to evaluate really 2 different types of mechanisms. The first being additive. So there's direct effects from early life on dementia accumulation with later life. So in other words, our early life experiences carried forward through impacting brain development and cognition. And this mechanism is represented in this model by the green arrows. And the second mechanism that I'm sort of evaluating are the chains of risk. So this is the idea that indirect effects from early life create social trajectories, and these are represented in the yellow arrows. So does early life adversity lead to low levels of education, which then impacts dementia risk, would be a question. And you might be wondering where race is in this model. In this case, I'm not going to be modeling race differences directly, but instead I'm allowing the models to vary by race to understand whether the pathways are contingent. So these are going to be race stratified models, in other words. So the data I use comes from the HRS. from 2000 to 2014. It is a large longitudinal study of older adults in the United States. It allows us to follow older adults as their cognitive status changes. Our sample is limited to adults 65 years and older, and is ideal for looking at race differences because it oversamples Black older adults. So whereas other studies may have had problems in getting enough respondents into these race categories, the HRS does not. So dementia classification is based on the Langer-Veer classification scheme that was developed for the HRS in particular and has been used in several studies that evaluate cognitive status in the HRS. This classification has two components. So first we have the self-respondence, which is based on the TIC score. And these are the four components that are being evaluated, which is immediate word recall, delayed word recall, serial subtraction of sevens, and backwards counting from 20. And second, we have proxy respondents. These are based on information from a proxy and whether the respondent has IADLs and an interview assessment. And proxies are crucial to include because these respondents are most likely to have cognitive impairment of some sort. So for my analytical strategy, to evaluate the life course pathways of dementia risk, I use a series of nested models. So in model 1, we have the childhood model. Here we evaluate being born in the South, childhood SES, and child health. In model 2, we then add in education. So any changes to the risk of earlier covariates suggest that there might be an indirect pathway. In model 3, we add an adult SES and health behaviors, which is the same thing. We're still evaluating changes across all covariates. And then model 4, we have the final model where we add cardiometabolic conditions. So I'm going to be providing results for Blacks and Whites separately for ease of inspection. These graphs will be summarized and I will not be providing the odds ratios. You're more than welcome to email me. We can discuss this further. However, also at the end of the results for Blacks, I will show the odds ratios for those born in the South and educational attainment in order to kind of show you some of the magnitude, since these are the two most important risk factors that I have found. So in these graphs, each word will either be bolded to signal statistical significance, struck through to signal it being explained away from the subsequent models, or gray to signal that has been accounted for but never found to be statistically significant. I've included a key to these in the bottom right corner of the slide. So here for whites, we see that being born in the South, having poor child health, and having childhood diversity were all related to the increased likelihood of having dementia, and they were roughly equivalent with about a 30% greater chance. Next, we introduced education to models, and when education is introduced into the model, the childhood factors continue to have a direct influence on the risk of dementia. Education also has a direct effect on the risk of dementia, and the effects of education are actually much stronger than the other covariates as we expected. But additionally, while the early life covariates such as born in the South, health behaviors, and SES adversity are still significant, the magnitude of them is actually reduced by about half. So it appears that a significant part of the association of these early childhood factors is actually through educational attainment. So next we introduce adult income into the model. When adult income and key health behaviors such as BMI, smoking, and physical activity are introduced, all are significantly associated with the risk of dementia. Here, what was surprising is we didn't actually find an association with smoking, but this is of course net of education of the early life factors. Child health and social disadvantage continue to have a significant direct association with dementia, as does educational attainment. And the early life and educational effects also decline when adult factors are introduced, pointing to the ways in which early life sets up sort of these cascading experiences that are associated with dementia. So this is the indirect pathways are being observed here as well. And then, however, interestingly, the effects from being born in the South are now fully explained with the inclusion of education and adulthood factors, suggesting that those born in the South have lower levels of education and probably worse adult SES and health behaviors. Lastly, we added diseases into the model, and when diseases are introduced, we see the expected association except for hypertension, which was most likely reflects how well controlled hypertension is. Surprisingly, when diseases are introduced in the model, there's actually minimal change in the effects of life course associations. And this suggests that the increased dementia risk from the other earlier covariates are not from greater risk of cardiometabolic conditions, which was a little bit surprising. And then for whites, dementia risk is very much a story of the life course exposure to socioeconomic resources, education, avoiding disease, and living a healthy life. And as you can see, although there are indirect pathways, it is still additive in the fact that childhood and adulthood and education all still matter. So next I will show the model for Blacks. We immediately find a difference between Blacks and whites. So among the childhood factors, only Southern birth has an effect on dementia risk, and whereas for whites, child health SES also had an effect. And this lack of effect of these other health problems could suggest that being born in the South maybe dampening the effect of these individual differences because the entire group is kind of being exposed. It might be a group level effect. So next we get on education. So more education is strongly associated with a lower risk of dementia, and controlling for education partly dampens the effect of Southern birth, but it does not explain it away. So Blacks born in the South have, and also Blacks born in the South may have lower levels of education, which is that sort of suggestion, and it's reduced by about a quarter. So next, we add in adult SES and health behaviors, and the associations of income, BMI, smoking are all essentially similar for Blacks and whites, except for, of course, smoking. And there was no association with physical activity. However, it is one of the most common risk factors associated with dementia risk, so that was a little bit surprising. And then also what's interesting here is that Southern birth remains significant. So whereas for whites, the increased risk of dementia from Southern birth was explained after including education, health behaviors, and adult SES, we find that Southern birth effect for Blacks is not fully explained by these lifestyle and education factors. And lastly, we looked at other health conditions as well. So stroke puts both Black and whites at risk of dementia. However, the other diseases differ in which race is at risk. This may point to differences in the consequences of disease. So for example, hypertension may be less of a risk factor for whites because of the way in which it's being controlled. And then similar to whites, the diseases do not explain the social and behavioral associations arising earlier in the life course. And the continued effect of Southern birth points to the importance of considering this context, and particularly for this group. So here I plot the odds for being born in the South and a high school education compared to less than high school. So the odds for Blacks are in blue and the odds for whites are in orange. And we can see being born in the South lowers, being born outside the South lowers dementia risk, especially for Blacks. However, it's not as great of an effect as education. And these two factors, once again, are the most important ones that were assessed in our models. So the key contributions, we have two main contributions for the study. First, we evaluate how life course pathways may differ across race groups. And we find that these life course pathways to dementia risk are not uniform. This has implications for disparity research because it points to the importance of evaluating shared risk factors and considering group-specific risk factors such as Southern birth and the Jim Crow. And this has implications also furthermore for disparity research because if we improve certain risk factors that are more consequential from one group, then we can unintentionally actually increase the disparity between them. And second, we show that Southern context matters. This may be because it's a group level effect, so individual differences in SES may not have a large impact on the risk. And all Black Southerners essentially were exposed to the same pernicious environment, the Jim Crow South, regardless of SES status. But this also points to considering why the South matters for health and how it might matter differently at specific points in the life course. So for example, here, the Southern effect for Blacks may be due to exposure to racism. And while it's a difficult concept to measure, we should strive to have studies or questions that evaluate how racism was experienced, especially during childhood. So thank you, and feel free to email me at mfarina@usc.edu.